probably has like which is a crazy number. Usually when they do that, it's like 6 months after. Some of those people.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here and tuning in. Today we'll have our situational update from Commissioner Morrison, hear from General Roy from FEMA, and get a transportation update from Secretary Flynn. This weekend, I spent time in Orleans County meeting with people who were impacted, as well as taking a look at the substantial damage to the Ethan Allen manufacturing facility, and speaking with the town manager about the ripple effect the temporary closing will have on the region and the hundreds of employees and families. I was also in Barry, Johnson, Waterbury, and Montpelier. 2 weeks after the worst of the flooding, it's clear in each community I visit how much work we have ahead of us. I also continue to be inspired by all those working on our response and recovery efforts, especially municipal and local officials who take on a ton of responsibility during emergencies like this. Commissioner Morrison will discuss how we continue to work with them and reiterate the SEOC structure we have in place should cities and towns need more assistance and how to request it. Yesterday, I joined Senator Welch, Secretary Tebbetts, officials from the farming community, and others for a tour of a farm in Essex. So far, we know of about 10,000 acres of farmland that has been impacted by the flooding. The message we got yesterday that's so important for the producers to hear is report your damage. For structures and equipment, use 211. But for your crops, produce, and livestock, and I know this gets complicated, it needs to go through the Farm Service Agency, FSA. You can learn more at agriculture.vermont.gov/flood. Senator Welch made it very clear that we need to have firm numbers on losses in order to build our case in Washington for additional help. Much like the importance of meeting the threshold for individual assistance in counties, it's also important for Secretary Vilsack when determining whether the U.S. Department of Agriculture grants my request for a disaster declaration. So again, to our farmers and producers, I know as you're dealing with all the stress from the floods, the last thing you want to do is report things to the FSA. But it's so important and could be the difference between whether or not Congress provides financial assistance and grants to you and other farmers. Lastly, and I know you've heard this from me before, but I need to stress it again, for everyone, individuals and businesses of all kinds, please just report your damage to 211. Either call 211 or even better, go to vermont211.org to report your damage. Even if your basement flooded and you've already taken care of it, report it. A few of our counties have not met the threshold for individual assistance, and I know they need it. So please help your neighbors and report your damage. With that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Morrison.
Thank you, Governor. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I will provide some information on ongoing State Emergency Operations Center activities, also known as the SEOC. The SEOC has been fully activated since July 9th, the afternoon of July 9th. The SEOC serves as the coordinating umbrella for all partner resources, including the National Guard, FEMA, the Red Cross, 211, and more. If you see one of those partners in your community, you see the state of Vermont in action. It is through these partners and our constant coordination and communication that we are addressing needs on the ground. Together with our partners, our initial response and rescue phase resulted in 211 people and 20 animals rescued, plus 127 people evacuated by our urban search and rescue teams. There were 74 hazardous material team responses in the early phase of the storm damage. The SEOC coordinated the opening of 14 state and local shelters, ultimately serving over 100 displaced Vermonters. As we shifted to recovery efforts, the SEOC remained busy servicing requests for information and resources from our municipal partners. A few examples of the type of assistance provided include providing large shipments of bottled water to 31 towns, providing dehumidifiers and fans to 25 of our hardest hit towns, providing PPE to municipalities and relief organizations, coordinating dam engineers to inspect municipally owned dams, providing geological engineers to assess slide dangers, connecting communities to drone services to survey damages, deploying rapid assessment teams to the field with plumbing, electrical, and structural inspectors who have completed over 800 inspections in both public and private buildings to date. Coordinating debris removal contracts that have so far hauled away over 228 tons, and that is just those that are on the state contract. We've addressed the loss of critical grocery stores by working with AOT to increase transportation opportunities between Hardwick and Johnson to Morrisville, and by coordinating with Shaw's Corporate to establish grocery delivery in the Ludlow area. We've addressed the loss of a local pharmacy in Hardwick by coordinating with Walgreens to provide a mobile pharmacy capability. These are just some of the ways, the many ways that our SEOC staff has problem solved to meet local needs. If your community has new or ongoing needs, here is the process to get help from the SEOC. Community members should raise requests to local leadership who will aggregate and prioritize these requests. The Emergency Management Director or local EMD for that community will contact the SEOC to make a request for assistance. This process is iterative as community needs are dynamic. Local EMDs can reach out to the SEOC 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If your community is in need, we want to hear from you. Lastly, I want to reemphasize what the governor said about reporting damages to Vermont211.org. Online reporting is preferred, but call takers are standing by to take calls from those who cannot access a computer. If your call goes to voicemail, rest assured that it will be returned in a timely manner. There is no backlog with 211 calls, and there has not been since Saturday evening. With that, I'll turn it over to General Roy, and I'll be available for questions afterwards.
Thank you, ma'am. A major disaster declaration was declared on July 14th, which provided funding for emergency protective measures as well as assistance to individuals who have damages to their homes as a direct result of the storm. Hazard mitigation across the state was also authorized. FEMA currently has 450 personnel in the field, including 14 teams, disaster survivor assistance teams, going door to door across the state to assist residents in signing up for assistance from FEMA and answering their questions, and encouraging residents to contact 211. We have established 7 mobile registration centers across the state in the 8 declared counties to help people sign up. We have personnel in the state multi-agency resource centers who can assist residents in signing up for assistance. And we have established 2 disaster recovery centers, one in Rutland and one in Waterbury, where people can go to sign up for assistance and also receive help if they're having trouble with their applications. We've provided bottled water for the state to distribute and are providing bulk water to communities who are having water systems disrupted. We are coordinating with other federal agencies to provide critical assessments to wastewater treatment plants and hazardous material. And we're supporting town halls by providing answers to residents about the FEMA programs. As of today, we have visited over 6,000 homes and 330 businesses. We've approved $6.2 million in funding for residents impacted by the storm. We've inspected over 1,000 homes for damages, and we've provided rental assistance for over 350 people. Residents whose address is not currently in a designated area may still apply for assistance by calling the FEMA helpline at 1-800-621-3362. 1-800-621-FEMA. They're open from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. daily. If you have applied for assistance for FEMA but have not notified 211, please do so. This information will help provide the state an overall understanding of the impact and assist in securing federal funding to not only restore the damages, but to help mitigate against future damages. The deadline to apply for assistance for individuals is 12 September 2023. To apply for assistance, you may visit disasterassistance.gov, download the FEMA app, or call FEMA's hotline, as previously mentioned, 1-800-621-3362, between the hours of 7 a.m. and 11 p.m. So what's next? FEMA is here for the long haul. While we are focusing on individuals right now, we're conducting assessments on the overall damages to infrastructure. And we'll work with the state to apply for and assist with reimbursement for damages to roads, bridges, culverts, and facilities. Additionally, we're working with the governor on establishing a long-term recovery for the state. This won't be a short-term mission for FEMA. We're here for the long haul. And I'll be followed by the secretary. Sir?
Thank you, General Roy, and good morning. I'll give an update on Vermont's roads, rails, airports. These are state roads, state-owned rail, state-owned airports, the 2 state dams, and also a brief on the current posture for the Department of Motor Vehicles. As I believe I said last week, state road systems are funded through the Federal Highway Administration. We are currently tallied at $35.2 million in cost, but I assure you we are nowhere near over our effort. State-owned rail, the lines that are owned by the Agency of Transportation, we are currently tallied at $62 million in damage and recovery effort. 7 roads remain closed, which is 12 miles. They are US 302 in Berry City, and I want to point out that this is a Class 1 town highway, which is a term that we use. The closure is orchestrated by the city of Berry in this case because of the local cleanup effort going on in that area, and we continue to work with them to see if there's any further assistance that AOT can provide to get that closure opened sooner. The work going on, as I think you probably know in that area, is some minor pavement repair and muck and cleanup operations in that stretch of Berry. I-91 in Hartford, the I-91 northbound exit 10A ramp to I-89 southbound into the state of New Hampshire. That is closed, has been for a while now, due to slope stabilization concerns on the right-hand side of the road as you're heading into New Hampshire. Vermont 131 in Weathersfield at the junction of Vermont 106 to Cavendish and the junction of Vermont 103. Multiple sites along that road have washed out. Vermont 12 in Montpelier, this also is a Class 1 town highway. The closure is controlled by the city of Montpelier. It is between Berry Street and School Street, and we will work in R with the city itself, and if there's anything that AOT can do to help that closure come down quickly or as quickly as possible, we will do that. Vermont 30 at Bridge 42 in Jamaica, between Vermont 100 and Amden Road. We will be installing a temporary bridge once that is in and the approaches are completed. That road could be reopened, but I do not have a time on that just yet. Vermont 110, which is a bridge, Bridge 12 in Chelsea, Chelsea north of Upper Valley Road. Again, that needs a temporary bridge installed, which is part of the reason that route is closed. And Vermont 113, Bridge 11 in Verchier, I think one of the first that I mentioned a few weeks ago, closed between Darling Hill and Verchier Center Road. Again, a temporary bridge structure will be brought in for that. 10 state roads remain partially open. We did have to close one lane last night of Vermont 15 in Johnson due to a landslide. Vermont 15 is open, but at that place in Johnson, it is restricted to one lane. The remainder of partially open roads are US 4 in Hartford, Vermont 125 in Ripton, two locations on Vermont 25 in Ripton, Vermont 103 in Cavendish, Vermont 107 in Stockbridge, US 4 in Bridgewater, Vermont 12 in Berlin, as I mentioned, Vermont 15 in Hardwick, and Vermont 110 in Chelsea. We did succeed in opening 2 roads in the last 24 hours. Vermont 100 in Jamaica, and I'm pleased to report Vermont 100 in Bridgewater, which was the damage received on Friday the 7th of July that the governor and I witnessed the day after. That is open to one lane. To date, 129 roads have reopened since the storm began. We currently have 3 bridges, as I mentioned, that need temporary structures. They are Verchier, Chelsea, and Jamaica. We have conducted 475 bridge inspections across the state of Vermont, both on state bridges and town bridges. 46 were done yesterday. 296 of these inspections produced what we call findings. A finding means that we will have to go back at some point to do some follow-up work, but that does not mean that the bridge is compromised or that it is unsafe. The Washington County Railroad from Montpelier Junction to Websterville. The national contracting firm R.J. Corman has over 50 employees working on that stretch of rail. I'm pleased to tell you that as of 10:30 this morning, an engine made it from Montpelier Junction to the roundabout by McGee Ford. There were some rail cars that have been stranded there, and those are able to now get out to the main line. We do not have a completion date from that location up through to Websterville. So that 11 miles will remain out of service. The Green Mountain Railroad from Bellows Falls to Rutland. I reported last week that we did have a win with 25 miles of that line opened from Bellows Falls to Ludlow. That is able to now serve the talc mill in Ludlow, Vermont. There were 2 landslides in Chester on that line last night. So we are closely watching what the hillsides are doing, but at this time they did not close that route. 27 miles, however, of the Green Mountain do remain closed from Ludlow to Rutland. Today, we have increased our contractor count by 9. We are working with 50 contractors across Vermont. This is just AOT. We are actively working with 13 towns. Just the other day, we pushed out $6.9 million in town highway grant funding that otherwise would not have gone out till October. And we will look at future payments on an accelerated basis as well. Those are typically made quarterly. I'd like to speak a moment about the posture at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Montpelier office remains closed to the public in all online services, mail transactions, and support for all of our business partners, which include Vermont dealerships, Vermont inspection stations, AGC, commercial trucking industry, and such, are being supported internally from the location on State Street, including driver improvement functions, hearings, suspensions, and reinstatements. The Dummerston satellite office will remain closed through August to allow staff to support the other southern satellite offices. The other physical locations for DMV, Newport, South Burlington, Rutland, Springfield, and Bennington and White River, remain open to the public as scheduled. You can find their hours of operation on the DMV website at www.dmv.vermont.gov. vermont.gov. We continue to encourage our residents to use the DMV online service for registration renewals, license renewals, and temporary registrations for purchases of all vehicles. By using these tools, you will receive a temporary document to support your transaction. It's also important to remember that registration and license renewals have been extended for 60 days under the governor's emergency order. This also includes out-of-state registrations that otherwise would have had to transfer to Vermont. And lastly, I'll say that any mail that may have been at the Montpelier Post Office the day of the flood is not accessible. It is undetermined how much, if any, mail for DMV was lost. We believe this may be impacting from July 4th to July 10th. All business partners are being contacted for that awareness, and the impact on other customer mail and transactions is undetermined at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, and we'll now open up to questions.
Governor, for counties like Orleans County, what is the threshold for people to report to actually receive that individual assistance?
Yeah, again, it's a very, and I'll let General Roy talk about this a little bit more, but it really is a very complicated formula, and some of it has to do with the number of people in the county and the poverty level and so forth and so on. Everything gets mixed in, and then they determine whether we meet the threshold or not. So I don't think it's something that we can define from the podium, or maybe not at all.
I think I can add more to what you said, sir.
Thank you, Governor. As the Governor said, it is a very complicated factor. The first thing we were to look at is the number of homes that were destroyed and damaged, whether they were minor or major, and then overall the other number of homes that were affected across the county. And then, as the Governor said, what's the overall demographics for the county? What's the poverty level? What are the greatest challenges? Are the roads cut off that are impacting people's ability to go about their daily business? So there are a number of factors that FEMA looks at.
And what's the concern there if a county like Orleans never makes that threshold? What does that mean for their recovery in the long term?
Well, of course, the direct result is those individuals aren't eligible for FEMA assistance. And for the maximum grant that's available for FEMA is $41,000 based upon the damage. That's the maximum amount you can get. There's actually been 6 Vermonters who have received that already. And then it's everything from a couple $100s for potential damages for renters, et cetera. So that's the totality of it. And again, we encourage everybody to, if you've applied for assistance from FEMA, also contact 211. Can't emphasize that enough, because it gives the state a totality understanding of the damages and may help it secure additional funding to help mitigate in the days ahead.
In the information that you've seen so far, is Orleans County close?
So I can't speak to that. We have teams from the region to do that assessment, working closely with the state and locals, and then the state and the region work together, region out of Boston, submit the package to headquarters. So I can't speak to that, sir.
This might be a question for Commissioner Morrison. Do you have a total tally for the number of people who have been displaced from their homes throughout the duration of this, including people staying with friends or family?
So that last part is very hard to calculate. People who just went to a friend, a family, or went out of state and have not come back to their home. We have some numbers. I want to make sure that we get you the most accurate numbers we have. We are in the process of matching 211 data to FEMA numbers that might reflect whether we're, 211 and FEMA are receiving the same amount of reports and the same overall nature of what the report is. So I'll do my best to get back to you on that. Can you remind me, Jason? But I don't have a number off the top of my head. And clearly it's a very dynamic number. Some people left in the initial evacuations or just out of an abundance of caution and are now coming back. So displaced in the beginning might not be long-term displaced. It's a very dynamic number, but we will do our best to put our arms around something quantifiable for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With those displacements,
Go, no, please.
with those displacements, there's been Vermonters across the state hesitant to report damages because they're worried about having to leave their homes. Is there any form of long-term plan on housing people if, say, it's really unhealthy for them to be back in those places?
So yes, we are working on a long-term plan. Let's be very clear, we were working on the housing solution long-term prior to the flood. This was a known issue that the governor can speak more to, or Secretary Samuelson can speak more to. The flooding just increased the number of people who are going to be in need of either short-term or potentially long-term secure housing. So the short answer to your question is yes, we are actively planning, and there are no easy solutions for this situation. In terms of homes that may become uninhabitable because of mold and something else that happens as a result of the flood, that's going to be a dynamic number that we might not know the full extent of for 4 to 6, 8 weeks. And those people will be rolled into the number that we're working with. Governor, did you want to say more about that?
Again, reporting the damage to 211 is so important because the congressional delegation is working on a supplemental ask of Congress to provide for amounts in excess of $41,000 that the General Roy had talked about. So again, it's not lost on us that the challenge ahead and the number of people who are displaced and may never go back to where they lived previously. So we are actively pursuing all avenues in order to provide for their relief.
Secretary Flynn, I'm wondering, I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned $35 million. Could you tell us what that number represents?
Thank you. That number represents the cost of the AOT response to this point on state-owned roads, which again, our funding comes through the Federal Highway Administration, not through FEMA. So, not to confuse the subject, we also own rail property, which is FEMA eligible. So that was that other number that I gave you. But the 35 million number is our current tally with the Federal Highway Administration for the work that AOT has been doing on all of the roads that I've been listing that have either been closed or partially closed.
So that doesn't necessarily represent what your estimated damage to the road system is?
In totality, that is correct. It does not represent that yet because we don't have that number yet because our work is not over with.
And when Secretary Buttigieg was here, whatever it was,
We could go yesterday, I think.
Yeah, he encouraged state officials to apply for the infrastructure grants that, I don't know if it would redesign some of the road projects, but try to mitigate future flood damage.
Right.
I think the application deadline was in the middle of August or something like that. Is that something that you plan to take advantage of?
Well, and I think some of that has to do with FEMA funding with respect to building things back with more resiliency. I know we did that at Tropical Storm Irene, especially with a lot of local bridges, but even on the federal highway side. So our entire financial book of business comes through the Highway Trust Fund. It comes through the reauthorization, which we're in the middle of right now, which is the 2JA, if you will. It's a 5-year tranche of money. And so anything we're doing in typical project order, we are trying to rebuild things in a better, more resilient fashion. And I think that's part of the reason why we didn't see as many bridges wiped out in this flood as we did in Irene. So the answer would be yes, we will continue to look for every unique pocket of money. There are grant programs through the U.S. Department of Transportation for bridges and culverts, if you will, which are separate and aside from our expected funding stream through the FAST Act or the reauthorization. And we apply for these on a routine basis. We are very aggressive about applying for grants that are available.
I just want to make sure everyone is clear on this. $35 million is just the initial response, getting the roads back open for now. That does not include permanent replacement of bridges and culverts and roadways and so forth and paving. It's just our initial response to date. So it's going to, the magnitude of that is going to be, many times over by the time we're done.
Governor, what is, and maybe for the Secretary too, what is your message to Vermonters who might be frustrated by the inconvenience of having to take sometimes quite a long way to...
Yeah, I mean, there may be some frustration there, but put yourself in the place of someone who's displaced from their home, still mucking out their home in the city of Barre or in Montpelier, or their business. It pales in comparison. So a little inconvenience on the part of having to go around. At least you can get around. Some of these folks are suffering a great loss and can't even get into their homes to stay.
The Secretary actually just mentioned this or touched upon it, but the work that we did during Irene, bridges, culverts, replacing all of those, how much of a difference do you think that made? Or was this a different dynamic?
I'll let the Secretary answer part of that, but I know from experience seeing some of the disaster areas. I was one of the first to come into Brandon, as a matter of fact. I don't know if you remember, but there was a pizza business, pizza building that was right in the middle of Route 7. So I had orchestrated with someone I knew in the industry that was able to get a crane in, lift that out of the way because it was blocking the road. Today, that culvert that went through there was undersized. So with the transportation dollars and the foresight, that was upgraded. And they didn't have the devastation, the damage this time around that they did then. So a lot of what we did after Irene helped. And that's the hardening, that's the mitigation measures that we need to continue to do. So we talk a lot about climate change, right? I mean, we talk about reducing our emissions, carbon emissions, and so forth. And that's good work, and that's something that we're focused on. But it has to be combined with an equal effort on mitigation. There's going to have to be buyouts. There's going to have to be replacement in using different technology and different strategies, so that we don't, because we know we're going to flood again in certain areas. But we can't just focus on just carbon emissions. We have to focus on mitigation.
You mentioned buyouts. Do you mean buying people out of their homes?
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
where are you in the thought process on that?
Well, I mean, we're 2 weeks into this, right? 2 weeks ago, we had the flooding. So first things first, trying to focus on the initial response. But we are having meetings, trying to determine what we do next and make sure that we're doing it for the right reasons. But that's why it's so important to have these discussions with our congressional delegation, because FEMA's not going to be able to take care of this. We're not going to be able to take care of this on our own. We're going to need congressional help with a supplemental bill in order to have, move forward on some of these buyouts that we know are going to happen in the future. But we want to build back. We want to build back better and smarter, and make sure that we're investing in our downtowns and so forth, but doing it in a much different way.
Will, would you mind explaining a bit the FEMA buyout process and how that works?
That falls under our National Flood Insurance Program. And so each community who participates in the National Flood Insurance Program works with the region, in this case in Boston, to assess the homes and see the totality of the damage. And if the cost of repairing a home is more than just taking it down, then that's the decision that the community will make. So it's a community level decision. They establish the prices associated with the properties, and it's a collaborative effort.
So would owners get fair market value for their home, or?
It's up to each community as to how they assess the values of the homes. And if I could just add one thing on the mitigation discussion. We all remember 2017 pretty well, some more than others, having been in headquarters. Remember Harvey, Irma, Maria. But if I said Nate, how many people here will remember that Nate? Nate was a hurricane that came in, into a different area in Alabama that had been hit years before. And because of the mitigation they had done by elevating homes, by adjusting culverts and so forth, the damages were relatively minor. And it was because it was a great example of the mitigation dollars being effective. I think the estimate today is for every dollar you invest in mitigation, right, you offset $6 from impact from a disaster, from a future disaster. I'm currently working an older disaster, older as in this last Christmas, for the Christmas storms, in which the utilities were hit pretty hard. But we have great examples where the utilities had used mitigation to help mitigate against future storms, and in fact they did. Those lines that we mitigated on from previous disasters held up this time. So as the governor has said, you know, we really need to look at how we rebuild and ensure that we are in a better place. Vermont is stronger after the storm than it was prior to. And I think that's the focus we have.
You mentioned the correlation between buyouts and the National Flood Insurance Program. Does an individual need to have flood insurance in order to be bought out of their home?
They have to be participating in the flood insurance program, yes.
On an individual level?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That is my understanding. I could be wrong. I'll get back to you if I am wrong.
That would take out the mobile home parks, I imagine, where a lot of them are in the floodplain already and don't have flood insurance.
I can't speak to that, sir, at this point in time. But we can provide great information for you in the future.
Just remember, that's why I keep talking about the congressional work that's being done for a supplemental bill to assist in areas like that. I think there are a number of buyouts that need to take place in different areas, but we're going to FEMA under the present structure, can't do that. But that's why we need supplemental funding in order to accomplish that. I want to have Secretary Moore comment further.
Thank you, Governor. I just want to draw attention to the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, which is a joint initiative of the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Public Safety that we've been advancing for the last 2 years now with some of the ARPA funds to fill gaps where FEMA isn't able to come in and offer relief to individual property owners. We created a special fund using ARPA dollars to affect some of those buyouts, and to great success so far, and happy to provide additional details on that program. In addition, the governor's budget included in money we needed to access pre-hazard mitigation dollars that were available to Vermont in fairly significant supply as a result of the way we accessed FEMA funding through the COVID crisis. And so taken together, those two programs have given us tools we've never had in the past to do this work, and that is work we've been actively engaged in for the last 24 or so months, well in advance of this particular event.
In terms of the buyout price, I'm sure part of the calculation I would think would have to be the fact that home prices in Vermont have skyrocketed, and if you get below fair market value for the house that was destroyed, how are you supposed to find a new home?
Right. In general, that's part of the Flood Resilient Communities program as well, is trying to make sure people are being compensated at fair market value. That's not to say that a home well outside a floodplain and flood hazard area may not have a higher starting value just on principle, but at least allowing fair compensation for the home the resident is currently in.
Since manufactured homes were brought up, is the state thinking about putting together a concentrated program to focus on helping people in those communities? Like, I think there was one after Irene.
Yeah, it's something that I was part of as well. And yes, we are actively pursuing that. We don't want them to feel forgotten, but we're trying to assess all the damage at this point and determine where we go from here. There is, through different levels, there is some FEMA funding available for short-term replacement and so forth of those homes that we are actively looking into and working with General Roy on that.
Governor, as you know, when it comes to the supplemental FEMA assistance working its way through Congress, maybe, as you know, we are in a divided Congress. There's been political fights over FEMA funding in the past. I'm thinking after Sandy. How confident are you, or what's the concern there of, you know, the timeline that we face for some of this money to get through Congress and whether we'll actually get there?
Yeah, you know, I think always concerned about the polarization in Congress, but these storms, they don't just affect blue states, they don't just affect red states, they affect all states. And so I think there's a realization amongst members of Congress that it could be them next if it already hasn't been them. So I think there's a certain sensitivity to that.
But you're aware there's a huge fight going down in Congress, primarily on a partisan basis between the House Republicans and the Senate Democrats about a whole slew of funding bills. And this is just getting dumped in the middle of that enormous fight. And there are some people down there who are saying, we're not going to allocate additional money for disasters unless you cut somewhere else. I mean, do you really have confidence that this political system can solve this?
Yeah, I don't know if I have as much confidence as is needed, but I think there is a realization. Take, for instance, there's been damage in northern New York. I know Representative Stefanik is looking into supplemental funding as well, right? So we have Senator Schumer, who represents the whole state. So I imagine that they might want to get together. There's damage in New Hampshire. I don't know how much, but they may need some help as well. So when you regionalize this and cross party lines, I think anything is possible. And I think that we've proven that time and time again, whether it was Senator Grassley and Senator Leahy working together on many different initiatives to help one another out, with the realization that, again, these storms don't just go to a red state or a blue state. They hit them all. And I think it could be whoever is being the obstacle, their state could be next.
Would it be fair to say that you are absolutely depending on this congressional funding in order to make a recovery? No. We are going to make a recovery, but we can make a better recovery if we have additional funding. So, again, FEMA has been very supportive of our efforts. The U.S. Secretary of Transportation has been very supportive of our efforts. There are pathways within the system now that will help us recover. We'll uncover every opportunity for us with funding and so forth that we can release to provide flexibility within state resources as well. So it's all hands on deck, and this would just help us make a better recovery, a fuller recovery, if we have congressional help.
Governor, I'd like to talk about post offices and schools. The Montpelier post office had the same warning as the rest of us about the flood coming. Have you asked them, have they told you why they couldn't keep the mail high and dry?
I have not.
Okay. The other question I have is, how many schools do we have now that are so damaged that they may have difficulty reopening in late August?
Yeah, I think Secretary Boucher, I think you had provided a couple of numbers, 6 or 7 schools that were heavily impacted.
Sure, Governor. So currently we have 9 schools across the state that have reported major damage and another 13 that have reported minor damage. It's unclear, one of those that we know that has reported major damage, we think will be fine to open, which is Montpelier High School from what we're hearing, in the fall. One of the elementary schools on our radar is perhaps not going to be ready to open, but we're still trying to figure that out. This week, we're actually doing a much deeper dive now that some of the initial recovery work at the schools has been underway to really get a sense of that. So we're pretty done with an initial scan of how many schools schools across the state have been impacted, and now we're trying to get a much better sense of, okay, and is the impact going to affect the opening of school in, about a month or so?
Is there a list of the schools that are affected?
Yes, and we can get that to you as we could last time. There's just been a few more updates since the last time.
Governor, there were some people looking at all the debris in downtown Montpelier and downtown Barrie, and I'm sure in many other communities around the state, wondering why it was taking so long to get the debris out of the downtown areas. And one of the contractors suggested to us that this stuff has all got to go to Coventry. I don't know if that's true. Is that true? Is this?
Well, we only have one landfill pretty much in the state.
So everything, all the damage and debris is going to Coventry, and is that sort of a clog in the system?
It gets a little bit more complicated than that, because some of the silt and affected soils, and maybe Secretary Moore could answer some of that, needs to be segregated and trucked to a different location, I believe, be aerated and so forth.
We have several different debris management strategies that are being deployed. The governor is correct, though. Coventry is our only landfill, and to the extent there's material that needs to go to a landfill, that is where it has to go. Contractors have been working to identify some staging areas where they can drop the loads out of the big trucks that are being used in the downtown areas to collect debris, further sorted a little bit, removing some of the valuable recyclable materials, and then trucking the remains to Coventry. We have been encouraging homeowners as they're cleaning out their basements to try to segregate household hazardous waste and electronic waste, and are working with partners in the solid waste management entities to arrange opportunities to collect those materials separately that we know we don't want to get mixed into that general trash stream. In addition, in locations where there's sediment and soils that have been impacted by petroleum products, we have set up separate areas where for those soils to be taken to so that they can be managed appropriately and reduce further environmental contamination. So it really is a multifaceted approach, and through the SEOC there's a debris team that involves staff from the Department of Environmental Conservation along with other experts from the hazardous spill or the hazmat team that have collectively put together this strategy.
I can come back through, but I think we have two people on the line. We'll start with Chris Roy, Newport Daily Express.
Yes, good afternoon. I have no questions. Thank you.
And Tim McQuiston, Vermont Business Magazine.
Nothing right now, thank you.
All right, Sarah.
You brought up the supplemental appropriations bill from Congress, and you also mentioned Senator Leahy, and we all know that he had such a legacy for really bringing home the bacon.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if it's something that you're thinking about now that he's not in office anymore.
I've been thinking about that ever since he left office.
Governor, you mentioned climate just a little bit ago. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see this morning yet, but the Secretary of State put out a message this morning saying that not enough in the state has been done in terms of climate, and mentioned that not enough climate legislation has been passed. But you did mention building back with more resiliency in mind. Do you have any additional comments on that topic?
I haven't seen the op-ed, but again, I believe climate change is real. I think that we need to transition away from carbon emissions, but we also have to have a balance here, right? I mean, we need to make sure that we're resilient and we mitigate this damage at the same time, because regardless, if we could magically throw a switch and eliminate carbon from society, that wouldn't stop this storm from happening, the storm next year, the storm 10 years from now. It's just something that's going to take some time for the world to heal. So we, at the same time that we're doing that work and transitioning, with electric vehicles and heat pumps and so forth, and upgrading our grids and electrical systems and so forth and so on, it takes time and money and resources and a workforce that can actually do the work. So at the same time we're doing that, we need really that resilience, the hardening, the mitigation steps in order to accomplish that. Anything you want to add to that?
Governor, also speaking of some of the congressional money, but also I believe on Thursday there's going to be a joint hearing of House and Senate lawmakers talking about sort of where do we stand with this flood? Does the legislature need to get involved? What do you expect, or will you be making plans for maybe grant funding or anything in your upcoming budget? I know it's early, but where does the legislature?
Yeah, I don't know, and we'll be testifying as much as we can on Thursday, and but we still have a lot of work to do with the recovery, and this is just the initial response. We're still in the initial response phase and transitioning to recovery. So we'll update them as best as we can, and then we'll have to see where we're at as we move forward. We have funding available now. We're receiving help from FEMA and again, transportation funds. So we feel we're in good shape from a financial standpoint today, but we're going to need some help in the future.
With that funding, we talked a lot about state roads, but is there any grant funding or loans maybe from the state available for people who live on private roads who are responsible for fixing those culverts?
Yeah, again, that would be over and above what FEMA covers, and it doesn't qualify under public assistance either. So that's one of those areas where we want you to report the damage so that we can get the magnitude of the amount to give our congressional delegation the tools they need to make the ask for what is it in totality, what is the damage in Vermont, and what's not covered. So that's why it's so important for people to keep reporting the damage they have and they suffer, even if they know they won't qualify today. It makes the case for supplemental funding.
Is the state doing anything to hold accountable absentee landlords? My colleague has begun hearing reports from tenants whose landlords aren't picking up their phones or aren't coming to fix, really bad damage.
I might ask if Commissioner Hanford has any information on that. This is something I hadn't heard much about, but
that's a difficult question to answer directly. What folks that are renters should do is 211, report their damage, and register with FEMA. Renters are eligible for FEMA assistance. Their landlords to repair the property are eligible for SBA loans. So it's a difficult situation for a renter that is in a damaged apartment. But the fact is that their property owner, their landlord, will need to fix that. And the renter is eligible for rental assistance to find temporary housing while the landlord fixes the property. The landlord is eligible for an SBA loan to fix the property at this point. So I heard a comment earlier about folks being afraid to report damages. That shouldn't be the case. FEMA is not condemning and kicking people out of damaged properties, but the renters that are affected need to report their damage and get FEMA assistance to help support their temporary housing needs in the short term while repairs can take place.
Sarah, as well, if you have names, if anyone has names of these absentee landlords, please get them to us, and we'll do everything we can to make contact. I think that's important through public safety and otherwise.
As far as, Commissioner, while I have you, as far as reporting damages to FEMA, if it's structural damage to the building that the landlord owns, I mean, shouldn't that be the landlord's burden to bear to coordinate with FEMA? That's a really big ask if someone doesn't want to call it.
No, I think I think what Commissioner Hanford is talking about is personal belongings, anything that they might have lost within the home themselves, not the building.
Right, exactly. That the renter is eligible for FEMA assistance for temporary rental assistance to find a place to live temporarily. The landlord's responsible for fixing it. Under the process and the funding that exists now, that landlord goes to SBA to get a loan. So some of these landlords have also lost their property and their livelihood. And so FEMA looks at individual assistance for homeowners and for renters in two different ways. Rental property is a business and will be eligible for SBA loans.
Time for maybe one or two more. Governor, was it announced, I guess, last week, maybe that there'd be $20-ish million in grants for businesses through ACCD? Do you know when we might get more details?
We're hoping Thursday.
Secretary Flynn, just a follow-up question. You mentioned license suspension hearings, so those are still happening?
Correct.
Yes. What if someone can't physically get to their hearing?
I would recommend they contact the DMV and try to get through to the hearing officer to at least describe what their situation is.
Is there an estimate when DMV in Montpelier is going to be back up and operating for the public?
I couldn't give you that right now, but I don't think it's going to be that long. I think some of it has to do with the overall citywide recovery work that's still occurring on State Street and, directing thousands, literally DMV downtown at 120 can see 2,000 to 3,000 people on a given week, foot traffic. So I think some of that is keeping in mind what's also happening downtown right at the moment.
Yeah, any transactions, I found myself when I had to register a number of motorcycles over the last couple of weeks. I went online to do it. I hadn't done that before, but it's very easy to do. If I can do it, anyone can do it.
Glad to hear that, Governor.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Did you guys see the schools that were damaged?